The year is 1841. The rain over the Tennessee wilderness falls not as a cleansing force, but as a suffocating gray shroud. It soaks the earth, turning the Natchez Trace into a churning river of mud, and it drums a maddening, relentless rhythm on the roof of the lonely way station known only as Hatcher's Stand. Inside, a lone traveler named Elias Thorne stares into the dying embers of the hearth. He had been a fool to press on as dusk fell, a greater fool to believe the storm would pass. Now he is a guest in a house that feels more like a trap. The air is thick with the cloying smells of boiled meat, damp wool, and something else, something metallic and vaguely sweet that catches in the back of his throat. He had paid for a meal and a bed, but the supper served was a greasy, stringy stew of indeterminate origin, and the bed offered was a simple straw mattress in a small, windowless room upstairs. The family, the Hatchers, had watched him eat. Jedediah, the patriarch, with eyes like chips of flint. His wife Martha, a specter of a woman who moved without a sound, and their two hulking sons, whose names he hadn't caught, both silent as the grave. They had cleared his plate and then simply vanished into the back of the house, leaving him alone in the oppressive quiet, broken only by the storm and the unsettling creaks of the old wood. Elias tells himself it is just frontier weariness, the paranoia of a man carrying too much coin too far from civilization. But he cannot shake the feeling of being watched, of being weighed and measured. He glances at the floorboards near the hearth, where the firelight catches a dark, ugly stain, one that soap and water had failed to conquer. It looks unnervingly like old blood. The history of the American frontier is written in hardship and blood, a relentless push into a vast, untamed continent. In the early 1840s, Tennessee was no longer the edge of the world, but its deep woods and winding hollows remained a realm apart. Civilization was a fragile concept here, a flickering candle in an ocean of darkness. Roads like the Natchez Trace were lifelines and gauntlets in equal measure. For every honest merchant or hopeful homesteader who traveled its length, there was a highwayman, a swindler, or something far, far worse waiting in the shadows. Disappearances were tragically common. A man could be thrown from his horse, taken by river currents, or fall victim to cholera. The wilderness consumed people, and the law, what little of it existed, was often too thinly stretched to ask questions. It was a world where a traveler's greatest asset was his suspicion, and his greatest liability was his trust. In this environment, remote inns and way stations were beacons of hope, a warm fire, a hot meal, a dry bed. But they were also places of profound vulnerability. A lone traveler, miles from anyone who knew his name, was entirely at the mercy of his hosts. He handed over his coin, his horse, and his safety, all on the promise of a stranger's hospitality. It was a gamble taken every night, in countless isolated cabins across the nation. Most of the time, the gamble paid off. But sometimes, in certain cursed and forgotten corners of the land, the house itself was the predator, and the promise of sanctuary was the most disturbing lie of all. The Hatcher family had built their stand at just such a crossroad of hope and despair. The patriarch of this strange, silent family was Jedediah Hatcher. He was a man carved from the unforgiving Appalachian rock, tall and gaunt, with a beard that hung like Spanish moss from a jaw that seemed permanently clenched. He had arrived in this part of Tennessee a decade earlier, with a wife who was already a ghost and two young sons who clung to her skirts. No one knew where they came from. They simply appeared, building their sturdy two-story cabin on a forgotten parcel of land that bordered the trace. Jedediah spoke little, and when he did, his voice was a low growl, as if the act of forming words was a physical burden. He was a man of immense physical strength, capable of felling an oak with an unnerving, methodical rhythm. He seemed to possess no joy, no fear, no emotion at all beyond a cold, calculating watchfulness. His eyes, deep-set and pale, missed nothing. They followed travelers who passed on the road. They followed the flight of crows, and they followed his own family members with an intensity that was more akin to a warden than a father. Local trappers and the few families who lived within a day's ride learned to give Hatcher's stand a wide berth. They traded stories of Jedediah's temper, of the time he nearly beat a man to death over a disputed property line, and of the disturbing lack of any sound, no laughter, no music, no raised voices, ever coming from the house. It was a place of profound and unnatural silence. He was a man who seemed to be not just living in the wilderness, but to be an extension of its most brutal, predatory nature. If Jedediah was the stone foundation of the Hatcher family, his wife Martha was the creeping ivy that covered it in shadow. She was a wraith in homespun cloth, moving through the dark rooms of the inn with a silence that defied logic. Her face, framed by tightly pulled-back graying hair, was a canvas of exhaustion and sorrow, yet her eyes held a spark of something else, a chilling awareness, a deep and forbidden knowledge. Martha was the one who cooked the meals, her back always to the guests, her hands constantly busy over the bubbling pot that hung in the great hearth. She never ate with the travelers and rarely spoke more than a single, whispered word. Her silence was different from her husband's. His was a silence of menace. Hers was a silence of complicity, of a horror so deeply ingrained it had stolen her voice. The few women from neighboring homesteads who had attempted to extend a hand of friendship in the early years were met with a vacant stare and a shut door. They whispered that Martha Hatcher was cursed, or perhaps broken by the harshness of frontier life and the cold dominance of her husband. But a few wondered if the truth was more macabre. They spoke of the unnatural cleanliness of her home, the way she would scrub the floorboards with lye until her knuckles were raw, as if trying to erase stains that no one else could see. They noted her patchwork quilts, stitched with a frantic, obsessive precision, each one telling a silent, horrifying story if you only knew how to read the patterns. She was a keeper of secrets, a silent accomplice in a long-running nightmare. The Hatcher sons, Caleb and Abel, were their father's shadow, stretched long and distorted. They were both large men, barely out of their teens but possessing the brute strength and sullen demeanor of hardened laborers. Like their parents, they were creatures of profound silence. They did the heavy work around the homestead, chopping wood, tending to the small, miserable patch of corn, and dealing with the livestock. But their most constant chore seemed to be maintaining the smokehouse and the large, unnervingly deep pigsty out back. They moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, their eyes downcast, never meeting the gaze of a guest. There was something not quite right about them, a developmental slowness that made them seem more like trained animals than men. They responded only to the grunted commands of their father, carrying out his orders with an immediate, unquestioning obedience. Travelers who stayed the night would sometimes be awakened by the rhythmic, percussive sound of the boys chopping wood in the dead of night, a hollow thump-thump-thump that seemed to keep time with the frantic beating of their own hearts. Rumors in the nearby town of Oakhaven suggested the boys were simple-minded, but the local physician, who had seen them once from a distance, privately disagreed. It wasn't a lack of intelligence he sensed, but a complete absence of conscience, a blankness where a soul ought to be. They were perfect instruments for a macabre purpose, human tools sharpened by a lifetime of isolation and grim, unspeakable work. The family unit was complete, the architect, the keeper, and the executioners. By 1841, the whispers about Hatcher's stand had coalesced into a quiet, forbidden folklore. It was not a place to seek shelter unless you were desperate. The inn had developed a reputation, not for bad food or uncomfortable beds, but for something far more sinister. It became known as a place where journeys ended. A lone merchant heading to Nashville, a preacher on his circuit, a young couple seeking new land in the West, too many stories began with they were last seen heading towards Hatcher's. Of course, no one could prove anything. The wilderness was a convenient scapegoat, a vast and hungry accomplice. A man's horse could return riderless, his saddlebags empty, and folks would shake their heads and blame the river or a sudden fever. Yet, the pattern was too disturbing to ignore. Local men, when drinking whiskey at the Oakhaven saloon, would lower their voices and trade tales. One man swore he saw Jedediah Hatcher wearing the fine leather coat of a land surveyor who had vanished the previous spring. Another claimed he heard a woman scream from the woods near the Hatcher property one moonless night, a sound that was abruptly cut off. But these were ghost stories told with a nervous laugh, because to accuse a man like Jedediah Hatcher openly was to invite a confrontation no one wanted. The local sheriff, a pragmatic man named Brody, had heard the rumors. He was troubled by them, but he had no bodies, no witnesses, and no evidence. In the eyes of the law, the Hatchers were just a strange, reclusive family running a business. The woods kept their secrets, and the family at the dark heart of it all remained untouchable. Back in his cold, airless room, Elias Thorne could not sleep. The thin walls of the cabin seemed to breathe with the house's ecrits, and every creak of the floorboards below sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through his veins. He had wedged the room's only chair under the simple wooden latch of his door, a flimsy barricade that offered more comfort than actual security. He could hear the storm outside, but underneath it, he began to discern other sounds. A low murmur of voices from the main room, too faint to make out the words, but the tone was flat, conversational, chillingly mundane. Then, a different sound. A heavy, dragging noise from the back of the house. It was the sound of something weighty being pulled across the rough-hewn floor, followed by a dull, wet thud. Elias' heart hammered against his ribs. He imagined one of the silent sons dragging a log to the fire or a sack of grain being moved. He tried to rationalize it, to dismiss the macabre thoughts that swarmed in his mind. But then came the most horrifying sound of all, a low, rhythmic sawing. It wasn't the sound of wood. It was sharper, punctuated by a grating noise that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. It was the sound of a blade working its way through something tough and resilient. It was the sound of a butcher at his work. Elias pressed his ear against the floor, his blood running cold. The rationalizations fell away, replaced by a single, paralyzing certainty. He was not in an inn. He was in a slaughterhouse, and the strange, stringy meat in the stew he had eaten for supper. His stomach churned with a sudden, violent nausea. He had to get out. Panic gave way to a cold, desperate cunning. Elias knew that bursting out of the room would be suicide. The two sons were immensely strong, and the old man had the look of a wolf. He had to be smarter. He looked around the small room, his eyes darting from one object to the next, searching for a weapon and escape. There was nothing, just the bed, the chair, and the damp stone walls. The windowless room was a perfect cage, but then his eyes fell upon the mattress. It was stuffed with straw, but the casing was made of thick, heavy canvas. An idea born of sheer terror began to form. He worked quickly, his fingers fumbling with the crude stitching at one end of the mattress. He pulled and tore until he had an opening, then began to pull out handfuls of straw, piling them silently in a corner. He was creating a hollow space, a human-sized cavity inside the mattress itself. His plan was insane, a long shot, but it was the only one he had. He would hide inside the mattress, pull the straw back over himself, and pray that when they came for him, they would assume he had somehow escaped into the storm. It was the frantic gamble of a cornered animal. As he worked, the sounds from below stopped. The sawing ceased, the dragging was done. An even more terrifying silence descended upon the house. He knew they would be coming for him soon. The lock on his door was meant to keep people out, but he now understood its true purpose was to tell them if their prey was still inside. He had to disappear. If you find this descent into the dark corners of history as compelling as I do, consider subscribing to the channel. The stories we unearth here are often forbidden, buried by time, and what comes next in the tale of the Hatcher family is a testament to the horrors that can hide in plain sight. The disappearance of Elias Thorne in the autumn of 1841 would have been just another statistic, another soul claimed by the Tennessee wilderness, were it not for one crucial detail. He was not a lone traveler. Thorne was a junior associate for a wealthy land speculator from Boston, and he was traveling with a specific purpose. He was a courier, tasked with delivering legal documents and a significant sum of money to a new settlement further west. His employer, a meticulous and impatient man named Alastair Finch, had given him a strict itinerary. When Thorne failed to arrive at his destination, and a week turned into two, Finch did something highly unusual for the time. He hired a Pinkerton agent to find his missing employee. The agent, a former lawman named Isaac Reed, was a relentless and observant man, ill-suited to the genteel drawing rooms of Boston but perfectly at home in the grit and grime of the frontier. Reed began his investigation not in Tennessee, but by meticulously retracing Thorne's entire route from his last letter home. He spoke to ferrymen, stable owners, and merchants, slowly piecing together a timeline. The trail was cold but consistent. Everyone remembered the well-dressed man from the east, and everyone pointed him further down the Natchez Trace. The last confirmed sighting placed Elias Thorne at a small trading post, stocking up on supplies before heading into the most remote stretch of his journey. The trading post owner recalled their conversation vividly. Thorne had been nervous about the coming storm and had asked about the closest place to find shelter. The owner had grimaced and told him there was only one place for 50 miles, a lonely way station known as Hatcher's Stand. Isaac Reed arrived at Hatcher's Stand on a crisp November morning. The place looked exactly as it had been described to him, grim, isolated, and unwelcoming. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney, but the house itself seemed dormant. As he dismounted, the front door creaked open and Jedediah Hatcher emerged, wiping his hands on a greasy apron. He stood on the porch, a silent, intimidating sentinel. Reed, unfazed, introduced himself and explained his purpose, asking if Jedediah remembered a traveler named Elias Thorne who might have passed by a few weeks prior. Jedediah's eyes, like pale, washed-out stones, stared at Reed without a flicker of recognition. He shook his head slowly. He saw many travelers, he grumbled. They came and they went. He couldn't be expected to remember every face. His denial was flat, absolute, and delivered with an air of utter disinterest. Reed pressed, describing Thorne in detail: his expensive coat, his leather satchel, his nervous disposition. Jedediah simply shrugged, the motion conveying a profound indifference that bordered on contempt. As they spoke, one of the sons, Abel, emerged from the barn, carrying a blood-stained bucket. He froze when he saw Reed, his eyes wide with a dull, animal-like alarm, before his father shot him a look of pure venom. The boy immediately scurried away towards the pigsty at the edge of the woods. Reed clocked the interaction, filing it away. He asked if he could have a look around, perhaps in the guest rooms, on the off chance Mr. Thorne had left something behind. Jedediah's face hardened. "Private property," he rasped. "Ain't no one here by that name. Best you move on." The threat was unspoken but hung heavy in the air. Reed, knowing he had no legal authority, gave a curt nod and mounted his horse. He had his answer. It wasn't in what Jedediah said, but in what he didn't. As Isaac Reed rode away from Hatcher's Stand, he did not head back toward town. Instead, he circled around, tethering his horse in a dense copse of trees where he had a clear view of the property. He was a patient man, and he knew that a direct confrontation would yield nothing. The Hatchers were a closed system, a fortress of secrets. He would have to observe them, to learn their rhythms, to wait for a mistake. For 2 days and 2 nights he watched. He saw the family's strange, methodical routine. They rose before dawn, worked in near-total silence, and retired shortly after dusk. There were no visitors. The only break in their routine was the grim, twice-daily trip the sons made to the pigsty, carrying buckets of a foul-smelling slop. Reed noted the smoke from the smokehouse, which billowed at odd hours, sometimes in the dead of night, filling the air with a strangely savory, greasy scent. He saw Martha Hatcher, endlessly scrubbing the porch, and Jedediah, who would often just stand in the yard staring out at the road, waiting. On the second night his patience was rewarded. Under the light of a full moon he saw the 2 sons, Caleb and Abel, emerge from the back of the house. They were dragging a large, heavy burlap sack between them. They moved with practiced ease, their powerful frames making short work of the load. They hauled it not to the barn, not to the smokehouse, but deep into the woods behind the property. Reed, his heart pounding, slipped away from his vantage point and followed at a distance, moving like a ghost through the underbrush. The woods kept many secrets, and he was determined to make them give one up. The Hatcher sons moved with an unnerving purpose through the dark woods, their path well-worn despite the lack of any visible trail. They arrived at a small, secluded clearing, dominated by a patch of earth that was visibly disturbed. The ground here was soft and loamy, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. Without a word, Caleb produced a shovel that had been hidden in the hollow of a dead tree, and they began to dig. Isaac Reed watched from the shadows, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. The scene was macabre, a midnight ritual performed with the efficiency of a daily chore. The boys dug a shallow, rectangular pit. Then they unceremoniously rolled the burlap sack into the hole. As it fell, the top of the sack came loose, and in the moonlight Reed saw a flash of polished leather, a riding boot, identical to the expensive, custom-made boots Elias Thorne had been wearing. He had found his missing man, or at least, what was left of him. But before he could process the horror, the scene grew even more disturbing. Abel reached into the sack and pulled out a small, tarnished silver locket, which he wiped on his trousers and slipped into his pocket with a look of childish satisfaction. They were not just disposing of a body, they were looting it. They quickly covered the grave, tamping down the earth and scattering leaves and branches over the top with a practiced hand. Within minutes, the ground looked almost untouched. The two brothers, their work done, turned and headed back to the house, their silence absolute. Reed remained frozen in the darkness, the image of the boot and the locket burned into his mind. He now knew this was not a simple case of robbery and murder. This was something systematic, a horrifying enterprise, and the body in the shallow grave was just one of many. Armed with this horrifying discovery, Isaac Reed rode straight to Oakhaven and went directly to the office of Sheriff Brody. Brody was a man in his late 50s, a veteran of the frontier wars who had seen his share of violence, but he was also a man bound by the constraints of law in a lawless land. He listened intently as Reed laid out his story: the initial investigation, the stonewalling by Jedediah Hatcher, the 2 days of surveillance, and the final, grim discovery in the woods. He showed Brody the detailed notes he had taken, including a sketch of the boot he had seen. Sheriff Brody ran a hand over his weary face. He was not surprised, but he was deeply troubled. "I've heard the whispers for years," he admitted, his voice low. "Folks go missing on that stretch of the trace, more than is natural, but whispers ain't evidence, Mr. Reed. A boot you saw in the moonlight, a grave you can't prove is there. It's not enough." Reed was incredulous. "You have a credible witness to them burying a body," Brody sighed, leaning back in his chair. "And I have a family of recluses who will deny everything, their word against yours. A jury round here. They're liable to believe the local man over the out-of-towner. Jedediah Hatcher is a cold devil, but he's our cold devil. To go after him, I need something undeniable, something I can put in front of a judge that he can't talk his way out of." Reed understood the grim political reality. He needed more. He needed to prove what was in that grave. He needed to get onto the Hatcher's land and dig. And for that, he and the sheriff would need a plan. The plan was simple and dangerous. Sheriff Brody, using his official capacity, would ride out to Hatcher's stand under the pretense of investigating reports of poachers in the area. This would give him a legitimate reason to be on the property and to speak with Jedediah. While Brody kept the family occupied at the front of the house, Isaac Reed, along with 2 deputized locals, sturdy men who had their own suspicions about the Hatchers, would slip in through the woods at the back and excavate the grave Reed had marked. They would need to be fast and silent. If Jedediah discovered them, the situation would turn violent in an instant. The risk was enormous, but it was the only way. The following afternoon, the plan was set in motion. Sheriff Brody rode up the muddy track to the inn, his demeanor calm and professional. Jedediah met him on the porch, his face an unreadable mask of stone. The 2 hulking sons stood behind him, their hands hanging loosely at their sides, their posture radiating a coiled, predatory stillness. As Brody began his slow, deliberate questioning about poachers and illegal traps, Reed and his 2 deputies, armed with shovels and rifles, made their way through the woods to the secluded clearing. The air was cold and still, and every snapped twig sounded like a gunshot. They found the spot Reed had marked and began to dig. The earth was soft and yielded easily. An inch of soil, then another. The smell of decay grew stronger, a sweet, sickening perfume that clung to the air. It didn't take long. The shovel struck something soft yet firm. It was the burlap sack. The moment of truth had arrived. With trembling hands, one of the deputies, a young blacksmith named Finn, sliced open the burlap with his hunting knife. The stench that erupted from the sack was overpowering, a gag-inducing wave of rot and corruption. They recoiled for a moment, steeling themselves before pulling the rough fabric apart. Inside was not the intact body of Elias Thorne. It was something far more disturbing, something that spoke of a chilling, methodical process. The sack contained what was left of a human being after it had been expertly butchered. There was a torso stripped of its limbs. There were hands and feet disconnected from their arms and legs. And there was a head, the face frozen in a rictus of terror, the eyes wide and staring at a horror only they had witnessed. It was unmistakably the face of Elias Thorne, identified from the photograph Reed carried. But it was the nature of the dismemberment that was most horrifying. The cuts were clean, precise. The large muscle groups had been carved away from the bone with an unnerving skill. The ribs had been separated as if from a side of beef. This was not a murder of passion. This was not a simple robbery. This was the work of a butcher processing meat. Finn, the blacksmith, vomited into the bushes. The other deputy, an older farmer, simply stood, his face pale, his eyes locked. On the grisly remains. Isaac Reed felt a cold dread settle deep in his bones, colder than any winter wind. He had investigated dozens of murders, but he had never seen anything like this. This wasn't just killing. This was harvesting. The whispers and folklore were not just stories. They were a horrifying, unbelievable truth. The discovery in the woods transformed the investigation. Sheriff Brody now had the undeniable evidence he needed. He left his post distracting Jedediah and rendezvoused with Reed and the deputies. The sight of the dismembered corpse in the shallow grave shook the veteran lawman to his core. There was no more room for doubt, no more need for caution. This was an evil that had to be excised from the land, immediately and without mercy. They wrapped the remains of Elias Thorne in a canvas tarp and carried the grim burden back towards Oakhaven. Brody sent one of the deputies riding ahead to gather a posse. He needed at least a dozen men, all armed, all ready for a fight. He knew the Hatchers would not be taken peacefully. They were not common criminals who would surrender when cornered. They were predators who would defend their territory to the death. The news spread through the small town like wildfire, confirming the darkest fears and forbidden rumors that had haunted the community for a decade. Men who had laughed off the stories of Hatchers stand now grabbed their rifles, their faces grim. The horrifying truth that a family of monsters had been living in their midst, preying on the vulnerable, turned suspicion into a cold, hard rage. As the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the Tennessee hills, a posse of 15 armed men, led by Sheriff Brody and Isaac Reed, rode out of Oakhaven. They were not just serving a warrant. They were marching to war against a house of horrors. The final, horrifying chapter of the Hatcher family was about to be written in blood and fire. The stories that were about to be unearthed from that cursed property would become a permanent stain on the region's history, a tale so macabre it would be whispered for generations. To ensure you don't miss the conclusion of this and other dark histories, take a moment to subscribe. We are dedicated to uncovering the narratives that have been deliberately forgotten. The posse arrived at Hatcher's stand as twilight bled into night. They approached cautiously, fanning out to surround the property. The house was dark, save for a single flickering light in the main room window. It was as if the family knew they were coming. The silence was absolute, heavier and more menacing than ever before. Sheriff Brody, his voice ringing out with an authority he didn't feel, hailed the house. "Jedediah Hatcher, this is Sheriff Brody. I have a warrant for your arrest for the murder of Elias Thorne." "Come out with your hands empty." There was no response. The only sound was the wind rustling through the bare branches of the trees. Brody repeated his demand, his voice tighter this time. Still nothing. It was Isaac Reed who noticed it first, a flicker of movement in the darkened window of the second floor, a shape, a silhouette gone as quickly as it appeared. "They're not coming out, Sheriff," Reed said, his voice low. "They're waiting for us." A palpable sense of dread settled over the posse. This wasn't a family cowering in fear. This was a nest of vipers, coiled and ready to strike. The men checked their rifles, the metallic clicks echoing in the tense quiet. Brody gave the signal. 2 men were sent to the back of the house, while the rest prepared for a frontal assault. They were about to step into a place that had been a gateway to hell for countless travelers, and they all knew that some of them might not be walking out. The wooden porch groaned under the weight of the first men who stepped onto it, the sound as loud as a scream in the stillness. The final confrontation had begun. The front door, made of thick, reinforced oak, was barred from the inside. It took the combined force of 3 men using a heavy log as a battering ram to splinter it from its hinges. As the door crashed inward, the posse surged into the main room, a chaotic jumble of rifles and flickering lanterns. The room was empty. The fire in the hearth was dead, and the stew pot that hung over it was cold and empty. But the smell that Elias Thorne had noticed was now thick and overwhelming. It was the scent of old blood, grease, and cooked meat, a stomach-turning combination that clung to the very walls. The posse spread out, checking the small, grim rooms on the first floor. They were sparse, almost unnaturally clean, the floorboards scrubbed raw. It was in the kitchen area behind the hearth that they found the first horrifying clue to the family's true nature. Hanging from iron hooks next to salted hams and sides of bacon were other cuts. They were pale and marbled and unmistakably human, an entire pantry of horrors stocked the flesh of their victims. The sight was so monstrous, so far beyond the comprehension of these simple farmers and blacksmiths that for a moment they could only stare in silent, nauseated disbelief. This was the forbidden secret of Hatcher's Stand. They didn't just rob and murder their guests. They consumed them. They were a family of cannibals. The room was a larder, and the dozens of travelers who had vanished on this road had not just been killed, they had been the main course. The true heart of the House of Horrors was not in the pantry, but concealed beneath it. While the rest of the posse was reeling from the discovery of the human remains, Isaac Reed's sharp eyes noticed something out of place. A large bearskin rug lay on the floor in the corner of the kitchen, an odd luxury for such a Spartan home. Driven by a grim hunch, he pulled it aside. Beneath it was a heavy wooden trapdoor, fitted with a thick iron ring. It took 2 men to heave the door open, revealing a steep, narrow flight of stone steps leading down into absolute blackness. A wave of foul subterranean air washed over them, the smell of a charnel house. Lighting a lantern, Sheriff Brody led the way down, followed by Reed and 2 other men. The steps descended into a small, claustrophobic cellar, dug directly out of the cold Tennessee earth. The scene that the lantern light revealed was a vision from Dante's Inferno. This was the family's workshop. A massive, blood-stained wooden table stood in the center of the room, its surface scarred with countless cuts from cleavers and saws. Tools of the butchering trade hung neatly on the stone walls, knives of all sizes, bone saws, meat hooks, and cleavers. In one corner was a pile of discarded clothing, a grim collection of garments from men, women, and even a small child's bonnet. In another, a mound of human bones, cracked open to get at the marrow. But the most disturbing discovery was the collection of personal effects, piled carelessly in a wooden crate: watches, rings, lockets, spectacles, and a small, leather-bound diary. It was a treasure chest of stolen lives, a monument to the family's decades of slaughter. As the men in the cellar stared in horror at the evidence of industrial-scale murder, the silence upstairs was shattered. A single, piercing scream, followed by the deafening roar of a rifle shot. The Hatchers had sprung their trap. Brody and Reed scrambled back up the stairs, emerging into chaos. The posse had been ambushed. Caleb and Abel, the 2 silent sons, had emerged from a hidden panel in the wall, wielding heavy wood-cutting axes with terrifying speed and strength. They moved not with the rage of cornered men, but with the cold, methodical efficiency of slaughterhouse workers, their faces blank and devoid of emotion. One of the deputies lay on the floor, his chest laid open by a single devastating blow. The others had fallen back, firing their rifles in a panic, the bullets thudding into the thick cabin walls. From the top of the stairs, Jedediah Hatcher appeared, holding an ancient, long-barreled rifle. He took aim and fired, the shot echoing like a cannon in the enclosed space. Another member of the posse cried out and fell, clutching a shattered leg. This was not a fight against a family. It was a battle against monsters who knew their territory intimately. They had turned their own home into a killing floor, and the posse, who had come as hunters, had instantly become the prey. The cramped, dark room was filled with gunsmoke, the screams of the wounded, and the horrifying, rhythmic chopping of the axes as the Hatcher sons continued their grim work. The ensuing battle was a brutal, close-quarters affair. The posse, though greater in number, was hampered by the darkness, the confusion, and the sheer ferocity of their opponents. The Hatcher sons were like berserkers, seemingly impervious to pain. They absorbed gunshot wounds that would have felled a normal man and kept coming, their axes swinging in deadly arcs. They fought without fear or self-preservation, their only goal to kill everyone who had invaded their home. Sheriff Brody, a seasoned fighter, rallied his men, directing their fire and trying to create some semblance of order amidst the chaos. He emptied his pistol at the advancing form of Caleb, who staggered but did not fall, his eyes still fixed on his target. Isaac Reed, meanwhile, found himself locked in a desperate struggle with Abel. The younger son was a mountain of muscle and rage, and Reed was forced to use the butt of his rifle as a club to fend off the swinging axe. It was a scene of pure pandemonium, the small cabin transformed into a whirlwind of violence. Lanterns were knocked over, plunging parts of the room into darkness and adding to the terror. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and fresh blood, a horrifying new layer added to the house's already foul perfume. It became clear that the Hatchers were prepared to die here, to take as many of their accusers with them as they could. This house was their kingdom, their larder and their tomb, and they would not surrender it. Amidst the chaos of the battle in the main room, one member of the Hatcher family was conspicuously absent, the matriarch Martha. While her husband and sons fought with savage fury, she had not been seen. Two members of the posse, having secured the back entrance, began a sweep of the second floor. The rooms upstairs were as grim and sparse as those below, small, windowless cells containing little more than a straw mattress on the floor. It was in the last room at the end of a narrow hall that they found her. She was sitting in a rocking chair, facing the wall, humming a tuneless, discordant lullaby. The room was filled with her quilts. They were hanging on the walls, draped over the bed, and piled in the corners. As the men entered, their boots loud on the floorboards, she did not turn. She just kept rocking and humming, a ghost in her own home. One of the men, a farmer named Silas, reached out to touch her shoulder. "Ma'am," he began, his voice gentle despite the violence raging below. "You need to come with us." As he touched her, she stopped rocking. She turned her head slowly, and the men recoiled in shock. Her face was a mask of utter madness, her eyes vacant and unfocused, but it was her hands they noticed. They were stained a dark, rusty brown, and in her lap she was clutching a small, half-finished quilt. She was stitching pieces of cloth together, but the patches were not cotton or wool. They were pieces of human skin, carefully tanned and cut into squares. On the wall in front of her was her masterpiece, a large, grotesque tapestry made entirely of human flesh, a patchwork of her family's victims. The fight downstairs reached its brutal climax. Sheriff Brody, having reloaded his pistol, finally managed to bring down the patriarch Jedediah with a well-aimed shot to the chest as he was reloading his own rifle. The old man fell from the top of the stairs without a sound, his reign of terror over. The death of their father seemed to break the sons' trance-like fury. For the first time, a flicker of something other than blankness appeared in their eyes, confusion, perhaps even fear. This momentary hesitation gave the remaining members of the posse the opening they needed. Isaac Reed, his arm bleeding from a glancing blow from Abel's axe, managed to fire his rifle at point-blank range, catching the larger son in the gut. Abel dropped his axe and collapsed, a look of dull surprise on his face. The last son, Caleb, wounded and now alone, let out a wordless bellow of rage and charged. He was met with a volley of fire from 3 different rifles, the force of the impacts throwing him backward into the hearth, where he lay still. The sudden silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the ragged, desperate breathing of the survivors. The Battle of Hatcher's Stand was over. Of the 15 men in the original posse, 4 were dead and another 5 were seriously wounded. The floor of the inn was slick with blood, a mixture of the posses and the Hatchers. The family that had preyed on travelers for more than a decade had been annihilated in a storm of righteous violence. In the aftermath, as the survivors tended to their wounded and the full scope of the horror began to sink in, the house began to give up the rest of its secrets. The diary found in the cellar belonged to a young woman who had disappeared with her husband 2 years prior. Her final entries were a terrifying account of their stay at the inn. She wrote of the family's unsettling silence, the strange-tasting meat, and the lock on their door. Her last entry was a single, frantic sentence, the ink smudged as if written in haste. "He's coming back for us. God help us, they know we know." But the most macabre discovery was yet to come. Behind the smokehouse, the posse found the pigsty, and in the thick, churning mud they found more bones, hundreds of them. Most were from animals, but mixed in were human bones, gnawed and cracked. The Hatchers had been feeding the less desirable parts of their victims, the gristle, the offal, the sinew, to their hogs. The pigs, in turn, were then butchered and either consumed by the family or, in a final, horrifying twist of irony, salted and sold as pork to the very community they were preying upon. People in Oakhaven had unknowingly eaten the remains of the Hatchers' victims. This revelation was the most disturbing of all. The evil of the Hatcher family had not been contained to their property. They had made their neighbors unwitting accomplices, turning them into cannibals by proxy. The curse of the family had seeped into the very soil, the water, and the food chain of the surrounding area, a contamination of the most profound and soul-sickening kind. The only surviving member of the Hatcher family was the matriarch, Martha. She was GHT out of the house in her rocking chair, still clutching her grotesque quilt, her mind completely shattered. She was taken to Oakhaven and held in the town jail, but she never spoke another coherent word. She would sit for hours, staring at nothing, occasionally humming her tuneless lullaby or going through the motions of stitching with her fingers. The town authorities tried to question her, hoping to learn the full extent of her family's crimes, how many victims there had been, how it all started, why they did it. But her mind was a locked room, the key long since lost to madness. Was she a victim, a woman broken and forced into complicity by a monstrous husband? Or was she a willing participant, the quiet, methodical architect of their domestic nightmare, her quilts a testament to a twisted sense of pride in their work? The question was never answered. Some believed her madness was a final act of self-preservation, a retreat from a reality too horrible to bear. Others saw it as a divine punishment, her soul shattered by the weight of her sins. After a few weeks, it became clear she would never stand trial. She was declared insane and sent to a rudimentary asylum in Nashville, where she died of pneumonia less than a year later, taking the deepest secrets of the Hatcher family with her to the grave. Her silence, which had been a tool of her family's trade, became her final, eternal legacy. The grim task of identifying the victims began. The cellar and the shallow graves in the woods yielded the remains of at least 30 individuals, though Sheriff Brody believed the true number was likely twice that, with many bodies completely disposed of or consumed. The crate of personal effects became a heartbreaking catalog of stolen lives. Isaac Reed, fulfilling his duty to his employer, identified the watch and signet ring of Elias Thorne. A locket was traced back to a young couple from Virginia who had been heading west. A set of finely crafted dental tools belonged to a traveling dentist who had vanished the year before. Each object told a story, a fragment of a life cut brutally short. For weeks, people from all over Tennessee and neighboring states traveled to Oakhaven, hoping to find some clue, some closure for their own missing loved ones. A mother identified her son's pocket knife. A man recognized the spectacles that had belonged to his brother. It was a slow, agonizing process of piecing together the horrifying scale of the Hatcher family's slaughter. They had been killing for at least a decade, operating with impunity, protected by the isolation of their home and the vastness of the wilderness. The official count stopped at 37 confirmed victims, but everyone knew the real number was lost to time, fire, and the bellies of the hogs. The sheer banality of the evil was what was most shocking. They hadn't just killed for money, the valuables were an afterthought. They had killed for food. They had killed because it was their way of life. The story of the Hatcher family cannibals became a national sensation, a piece of macabre folklore that spread through newspapers and penny dreadfuls across the country. The tale was embellished, exaggerated, and transformed into a lurid spectacle of frontier horror. Jedediah became a 7-foot-tall demon, the sons were described as half-witted giants, and Martha was a witch who practiced black magic. Hatcher's Stand was no longer just a remote inn. It was a human slaughterhouse, and the devil's larder. The reality, as Isaac Reed and Sheriff Brody knew, was somehow more chilling than the fiction. The Hatchers weren't supernatural monsters. They were human beings, a family unit that had become pathologically warped, their capacity for empathy erased and replaced by a cold, practical predatory instinct. Their evil was not loud and theatrical. It was quiet, domestic, and terrifyingly efficient. This was perhaps the most disturbing lesson from the whole affair, that the greatest horrors do not always come from demons or ghosts, but from the person right next to you. They can come from the quiet neighbor, the silent host, the family down the road. The Hatcher case served as a brutal reminder to a nation obsessed with westward expansion that the wilderness was not the only thing to be feared. Sometimes, the most dangerous frontier was the one that existed behind a neighbor's closed door. What becomes of a place so thoroughly saturated with evil? A week after the battle, after the last of the remains had been removed and the posse had disbanded, a group of men from Oakhaven, led by the brothers of one of the victims, rode out to Hatcher's Stand. They didn't go to loot or explore. They went to cleanse. They carried torches and cans of kerosene. Without ceremony, they set the house, the barn, and the smokehouse ablaze. They watched in grim silence as the flames consumed the structures, the fire roaring into the night sky, as if the earth itself were trying to cauterize a poisoned wound. They burned it all to the ground, hoping to erase the stain of the Hatcher family from the landscape. But some stains can never be removed. The story lingered, becoming a permanent part of the local geography of fear. The land where the inn once stood was said to be cursed. Locals claimed that nothing would grow there, that animals would not cross it, and that on dark, moonless nights, you could still hear the faint sound of an axe chopping wood or a woman humming a tuneless lullaby on the wind. The blackened patch of earth became a forbidden place, a tangible monument to the horror that had occurred there. Travelers on the Natchez Trace would spur their horses, riding faster as they passed the area, feeling a sudden, inexplicable chill, never knowing they were passing over the ashes of a house where nightmares were made real. The fire had destroyed the building, but it had only immortalized the legend. One question forever haunted those involved in the case. Why? What could possibly motivate a family to engage in such systematic, long-term atrocity? There were no grand manifestos, no confessions, no letters left behind to explain their actions. The community and the press were left to speculate, to try and impose some kind of logic onto the illogical. Was it a matter of survival? Did the harshness of frontier life, a failed crop, or a brutal winter drive Jedediah to his first kill, only to discover a grimly practical solution to his family's hunger? This was the most charitable explanation, the one that allowed people to sleep at night. It framed the Hatchers as victims of circumstance, driven to monstrous acts by desperation. But Isaac Reed and Sheriff Brody never believed it. The evidence suggested something far darker. The Hatchers were not starving. They had a small farm and their smokehouse was always full. And more importantly, there was the matter of the valuables they collected. They didn't sell them, they hoarded them like trophies. This wasn't about survival. It was about power, control, and perhaps a perverse and horrifying form of pleasure. Jedediah Hatcher was a predator who had found the perfect hunting ground, a place where his prey came to him willingly, and he had taught his children to be the same. The motive wasn't hunger for food, but a hunger for dominance, a complete and total power over the lives of others, from their last meal to their final, terrifying moments. The legacy of the Hatcher family extends beyond the grim folklore and the patch of scorched earth where their home once stood. It speaks to a darker undercurrent of the American frontier experience. The narrative of westward expansion is often one of heroism, manifest destiny, and brave pioneers taming a wild land. But for every story of courage and community, there are countless others that are darker, more complex, and have been deliberately forgotten. The frontier was a place of immense isolation and lawlessness. It was a pressure cooker that could forge heroes, but it could also create monsters. What happens to a family unit when it is completely cut off from society, from moral authority, from any eyes but its own? The Hatchers are a terrifying case study. They created their own savage morality, their own horrifying traditions, their own self-sustaining ecosystem built on murder and cannibalism. They were a sovereign nation of four, with Jedediah as their brutal king. How many other families like them existed? How many other isolated cabins along forgotten trails held similar, unspoken horrors? The vastness of the continent that promised so much freedom also provided the perfect cover for unspeakable acts. The story of the Hatchers is disturbing not just for what they did, but for the horrifying possibility that they were not entirely unique. They are a symbol of the darkness that can flourish in the empty spaces on the map. Isaac Reed, the Pinkerton agent who had set the entire discovery in motion, was hailed as a hero. His meticulous investigation and unwavering pursuit of the truth had exposed an evil that might otherwise have continued to fester for another decade. His employer, Alastair Finch, paid him a handsome bonus for solving the murder of Elias Thorne, though the details of Thorne's ultimate fate were tactfully omitted from the official report back in Boston. Reed, however, took no satisfaction from the praise. The things he had seen in that house, the pantry, the cellar, Martha's grotesque quilts, had left a permanent scar on his soul. He had looked directly into the abyss, and the abyss had looked back. He left Tennessee shortly after the Hatcher property was burned, and records show he resigned from the Pinkerton agency a few months later. He was a man who had made his living by confronting the worst of humanity, but the Hatchers were different. They were a horror beyond his experience, a perversion of the natural order that defied all reason. He reportedly retired to a small farm in rural Pennsylvania, never speaking of the case again. He had unearthed the forbidden truth of Hatcher's stand, but in doing so, he had unearthed a darkness that he could not bury, a macabre memory that would walk with him for the rest of his days. The hero who slayed the monsters carried a piece of their monstrosity with him forever. The tale of the cannibal family of the Natchez Trace became a cautionary story, a tool used by parents to frighten children into behaving, and by travelers to remind themselves of the dangers of trusting strangers. But over the generations, the facts began to erode, replaced by the more palatable specter of fiction. The story became a ghost story, a campfire tale. The real human horror of the Hatcher family was too much to confront directly, so it was softened into a legend. The names changed, the details blurred. They became the Tennessee Takers or the Whispering Butchers. The true story, with its grim details of butchery, of a mad seamstress and a pantry of human flesh, was deemed too disturbing for polite history. It became a piece of forbidden knowledge, a cold case that was both solved and eternally mysterious. The official records from Oakhaven, including Sheriff Brody's detailed report and the inventory of items found in the cellar, were lost in a courthouse fire in the late 1880s. Perhaps a convenient accident, a final attempt by the community to bury a history they could no longer bear. All that remains today are the whispers, the folklore, and the chilling realization that for more than a decade, in the heart of a young and hopeful nation, a family turned hospitality into a horrifying, macabre art form, and therein was nothing more than a doorway to the supper table. The deepest, most unsettling truths are often the ones we work hardest to forget. If you appreciate our commitment to digging up these banned and buried histories, Support the channel by hitting the like button and subscribing. Every story we tell is a testament to the fact that the past is never truly dead. Consider the ecosystem of the Hatcher family. It was a closed loop, a horrifyingly self-sufficient model of predation. The road brought them their raw materials. The house was their processing plant. The woods and the pigsty were their waste disposal systems. Their victims provided them with food to live, valuables to hoard, and in the case of Martha's macabre craft, the very materials for their art. It was a system perfected over a decade of practice. They were the ultimate parasites, living off the lifeblood of the nation's expansion. Every traveler who stopped at their door was not a guest but livestock. Every knock was the sound of a delivery. This clinical, detached view of their fellow human beings is perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire affair. They did not seem to hate their victims. They were not driven by rage or revenge. They were simply harvesting. A farmer does not hate the corn he reaps or the hog he slaughters. It is a matter of practical necessity. The Hatchers had simply reclassified human beings as a viable, plentiful, and easily accessible food source. They had stepped so far outside the bounds of conventional morality that the concept of murder, as we understand it, may not have even applied in their minds. It was just work. And the horrifying efficiency with which they performed this work speaks to a level of psychopathy that is almost impossible for a sane mind to comprehend. Today, the Natchez Trace is a scenic parkway, a quiet, beautiful road that winds through the Tennessee hills. Millions of people travel it every year, admiring the autumn colors, the historic sights, and the peaceful wilderness. But the history of the Trace is written in blood. For every scenic overlook and picnic area, there is a ghost. The ghosts of the merchants, the homesteaders, the preachers, and the countless unknown souls who vanished along its length. The modern road papers over a much darker past. If you were to drive it today, you would pass by the area where Hatcher's stand once stood. There is no sign, no marker. The land has been reclaimed by the forest. The scorched earth is now covered with a century and a half of leaves and new growth. It looks like any other stretch of woods, but a place like that never truly loses its memory. The violence and terror that soaked into that soil has left an indelible, invisible mark. Perhaps the land itself remembers. Perhaps the trees whisper the names of the dead. It is a sobering thought that we move through a world that is layered with forgotten histories, that the ground beneath our feet is often the site of unimaginable suffering. The serene beauty of the present is built upon the ashes of a macabre and horrifying past, and most of the time we travel on, completely unaware of the darkness we are passing over. In the end, the story of the Hatcher family leaves us with a profound and unsettling mystery. Not the mystery of what they did, or how they were caught, but the mystery of the human heart itself. How does such a complete and total corruption take root? Was Jedediah born a monster, or was he made one by the world he lived in? Was Martha's madness the cause of her complicity, or the result of it? And what of the sons, Caleb and Abel? Raised in a world where butchering guests was as normal as chopping firewood, did they ever even have a chance at a soul? These are questions without answers, lost to the fire that consumed their home and the silence of the grave. The Hatcher case serves as a chilling testament to the fragility of civilization. It reminds us that society, law, and morality are thin veneers, and that in the deep, isolated corners of the world, they can be stripped away, revealing the primitive predator that lurks beneath. The most disturbing truth of all may be that the Hatchers are not an aberration, but an example of what humanity is capable of when left alone in the dark. Their forbidden story is a permanent shadow on the pages of history, a cold case that whispers a single, horrifying question from the past. How many more were there?